I was just reading what she wrote about the itinerary. So we meet at 6:30, the bus leaves at 7. We get a 30-minute rest stop. And then when we get to Pittsburgh, well, if you can, oh, look at that writing.
And look who you brought with you.
Yeah.
Hi, how are you, Sheila?
Hi, Phil.
I don't know if you ever met my husband.
I'm in
This
church.
is Phil, this is Sheila
Hi, Phil.
Long.
Oh, hi,
She's
nice to
from
meet you.
church. But she has Marge with Julia and writes postcards.
Postcards, I've heard
Which
the
is
name.
good.
Yes, so, yeah.
Funny how we're all connected, right? You know?
Yeah, oh, I got a call from you. So, yeah, we weren't sure if we were the only ones, but we'll find out. Well, this is wonderful. I'm very
My friend
excited.
Rose will come. You know Rose Metzger?
Yeah, she's coming.
She has a dentist appointment this morning, unfortunately, but she's going to come in 2 weeks.
Oh, okay.
The next one.
Okay.
Yeah.
I finally figured out where that church is. It's where the apartments are.
Yeah,
Right
there
next
was-
to, right next to Forest Elementary
I
School.
kept thinking, I can't think of a church. And then I found that.
Yeah, the apartments are connected.
Yeah, our garden club, Forest Stream Garden Club, is there.
Oh.
And that's where I turned to go to the convent. So it's like, I thought, how could I not know this?
Oh, right, it's at that three-way intersection.
Yeah.
So I have an advance copy of the Pittsburgh trip.
Oh,
Oh, you're going on it?
We
too?
are.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
fact, last night we looked at it with one of my friends and I said, have you ever been to Fall River? She goes, no. I said, you want to come to Pittsburgh with us? I said, there's a few more seats left. So I don't know if she's going, I sent her the flyer.
Oh,
You did
there
send
are
me the
four
flyer.
seats left.
Oh, really?
Four more people. There are 31, which her goal was to get 30. And we're at 31, and then they don't want to fill up the bus, and also, because it seems 40, but there needs to be room for the tour guide to
I'll bring a chair over here.
go.
Maybe you want to put.
See, a lot of these places, I've been to Pittsburgh a couple of times, so I've been to.
So would people know that to tune in? Are they tuning in right now?
If they live in-
Could they?
Probably not.
No.
It just would have been fun to go on a
Asynchronous.
trip with you.
I like how they're
It's
calling
eight,
it.
eight here. You want to sit down? And we'll just put two chairs here.
It's called President.
Oh, that's a great area.
Hey, where are you going?
Did he say hi, neighbors?
I love how we're talking about neighbors and my neighbors are them.
Ah, that's cute.
Yeah. Yeah, Rabbi Alex loves his dogs right by.
He isn't, yeah,
We just have a different route now.
yeah. Everybody else in the dog walks by, it's just constant.
Yeah, everyone wants their dogs here. All right, we're gonna get started. We're here just so the stream will pick up. So anyone joining us, we're happy to have you. This is Bill. Bill and I have run a class together for 5-6 years now, at least. No, maybe 8 or 9 years actually. So we finally settled on love your neighbor as yourself, the golden rule. And we're going to have, this is the Jewish perspective this time, and then we'll get the Christian perspective next 2 weeks from now at North Presbyterian at 11 o'clock. So before we start on kind of the material, I thought we'd talk about neighbors. You know, we're neighbors in a way. We're spiritual neighbors. What does it mean to love you? I mean, I love you, Bill. What does it mean? What do you think?
Well, I think it has to do with a sense of regard and concern and, a realization that the things that happen to you affect us and we care about that. And vice versa, I think, that, when you identify as a neighbor to another person, it's not just, you're not just talking about your proximity. You're talking about a more sort of a emotional attachment that you share with that person or that group, and it broadens your own sense of self, and we learn over time that you know, the world is a lot bigger than our narrow little slice of it.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting because neighbors, you know, we have a long-standing neighborly relationship that goes back several decades at least. But we have our church next door, which sometimes we share parking lot space with. And we have a church right on North Forest that's closer to us, that's right across Global Ministries, that we really don't do anything together with. Not only that, we were talking beforehand, they're the neighbors who actually live in the neighborhood right next to it. We have a relationship. If we play our music too loud or we have too much going on, it's going to in fact affect them. If the parking is all on Indian Trail Drive, they're not going to be too happy about it. But they also might use our parking lot on occasion, or they, you know, there might be some shared activity. So your neighbors really range. You know, I love my neighbors. My father-in-law said when we moved to Buffalo looking for a house, he said, number one, make sure you know who your neighbors are. And we bought the house that we actually had met both sets of neighbors on either side of us in the process, because we went to the house twice. And so that cemented it. We knew the neighbors, so that was going to work pretty well. But you could have a range. You could love your neighbors. They could be like family love. Or, you know, they can be there, and you can make sure not to, you know, put your poop bag in their trash, but not necessarily anything more than that.
Right. Yeah, I think that's, you know, in your own neighborhood, you may not know all the people who live there. If you live in an area where there's a lot of turnover of neighbors, you just don't have a chance to get to know them the way maybe in the past neighborhoods were more sort of stable and long-lived. I remember I grew up in a small town, knew all our neighbors, and all of them knew us. My parents were both born there, and so it was an environment where a kid couldn't get away with anything because everybody knew your parents. And, you know, that kind of world just doesn't exist here. I mean, my kids haven't experienced that kind of a world. But how we, you know, negotiate those relationships too, I think is really important. For instance, with the church, you know, we have folks who live nearby along the parking area, and when we plow, the snow often gets piled up against a fence, and sometimes it, you know, crushes a fence. And we get calls, and we have to figure out, you know, how to fix those things and try to be mindful of that, how we impact the people around us. So, you know, there are just so many, I think, large and small ways that we do sort of interact with folks that we may not always be aware of, and learning to be mindful of that and what's happening around you is really, I think, a big part of it. It reminds me, what you were talking about reminds me of that poem by Robert Frost, Mending Walls. And it's about two farmers who go along the wall that separates their properties. And the narrator of the poem is sort of musing, you know, why are we doing this? Why are we having to fix this? And his neighbor keeps saying, you know, good walls make good neighbors. And but in the end, the sort of final sort of observation of the narrator is, this is just separating us. It's just keeping us apart when, you know, we're actually, you know, we're in this life together, and we need to acknowledge that we need one another to really be fully human. And so it's a neat poem. It's one of my favorites.
So, actually, and I'm going to turn it over to our group here in terms of to think about their own neighborly relations, good and bad. But I was thinking during the blizzard, our street, which has had a lot of turnover, there's about 20 houses on it. It's a small cul-de-sac. And, most of the people on the street moved in the 70s and 80s. We're some of the newcomers, although we've been there 15 years, so I'd say now we're more senior. But during the blizzard, where our street, because it's a cul-de-sac, wasn't plowed for 6 days, everyone had power, thank God, so that was great. But there's a lot of elderly and a lot of shut-ins. So my immediate neighbor, Robert, who I love, they're practically our family here. We went up and down the block, and I brought my kids, and we shoveled as best we could anyone who we thought was going to be shut in. And we checked, and we made sure their exhaust pipes were okay. And we realized that, A, there's no system in place to talk. There's one neighbor down the block named Tom, and he's a wonderful guy. He's a big baseball fan, Detroit Tigers. And he's the connector. He had everyone's number. No one else had that. But there were significant things, and actually one of our neighbors who had didn't know very well, but is only a few houses down, she had a health crisis, and her health had been going down. And on the Tuesday, right as everything was getting plowed, she ended up dying, and because of her aide wasn't normally there, and it's a very sad situation. We actually had plowed out. My daughter had been one of the people that had, plowed her door, or had shoveled her door so it could be open, and that was the only way the paramedics got in. So you realize how vulnerable in those situations, like 9/11, where suddenly you realize, oh, I have neighbors, and I need to know them, and they might be the ones that save me if I only recognize that. And I felt so fragile. I felt the ecosystem of our block was so fragile because so many of these individuals were single, with poor health, often elderly, and not, when you're stuck on your block and it's 3 feet of snow between you and the front of the block, you notice it, who has the resources. So I'm going to pass it on, and tell me, what are your neighborly relations? We'll bring out the, hold on, let's get this off. All right. Anyone want to give your 2 cents? Yeah. My direct neighbor, just down the block. I call you a neighbor. Is that a neighbor when you're like down the block? Yeah.
Definitely neighbors. Going along with what the rabbi was saying, I live at Long Meadow in Westfield, and I moved in there 56 years ago. I was 20 years old and had 2 babies, so I was the new young mom in the neighborhood, and I thought everyone around me was so old. They were old neighbors. So fast forward now, and I've got a lot of new neighbors, like you said, turnover, and I thought, isn't this great? They all want to be my friend. This is so cool that I've got new friends now. And it took me a little while to realize I was now the old lady in the neighborhood, and they were checking on me and taking care of me, not wanting to be my new best friends. But they're great neighbors, and sometimes we've had an emergency in our family, and they've brought meals, and they plowed us out, like you said, and brought us gifts, and it's just an amazing that this has happened recently, and through all that 56 years, I don't think I had relationship with neighbors that intense. So sometimes it pays to be the old lady, so.
Where to get better neighbors.
And we have only been in our current house for about 6 years. So we are relatively new, but there has been a bit of turnover. We live on a really long street, but we only know our neighbors kind of across the street, next door, couple down. We don't know a lot of them, and they all did check in on us, but we checked in on each other through that storm in December. There is a health crisis right now in our neighborhood, and the couple, it's a couple our age, and we've been wanting to help them, but they don't want help. And so then you feel helpless. You feel like it's a very serious illness, and you just don't know what to do. They don't want food. They don't want assistance. So,
You pray.
yeah, you pray. That's about all we can do. Yeah.
Anyone else? Up to you. Oh, yeah. Sorry, yeah, it's not going to go all the way back. You're my office lady.
So I was born in Buffalo, but I lived in Rochester for many years, probably about 39 years. And it's amazing the difference in the two cities. And this is not anti-Rochester. There's a lot of nice things about that too. But as far as neighbors go, I would live in a neighborhood for 4 or 5 years and we would not know anybody. Nobody would say hello to you. And then I moved back to Buffalo, and now in our little corner of the world, people helped us shoveling out. We've had them over, things like that. But it's just such a different philosophy from the two cities that are right down the thruway from each other. It just always kind of amazes me. So Buffalo really can truly be the city of good neighbors.
Well, if you put it in your motto. Yeah. Here, Phil. No, Phil, I can bring it up.
It's very interesting. When we bought our first house in Tonawanda, the very first thing that I remember is I drove home from work and my driveway was plowed. And I'm thinking that somebody forgot to turn their snowplow contract off. And it turned out that the gentleman across the street had taken his snowblower, and we had never met, and he had done our driveway as kind of a welcome to the neighborhood. And the next couple days, we got a welcome, very large cake. I have no idea what we did with it, from our next door neighbor, just saying welcome to the neighborhood. The flip side is we've had plenty of neighbors over the years. The only thing we see of them is they'll politely wave as they're pulling into their garage with a garage door opener. They close their garage, and we've never seen them, other than we know who they are, and you know, we wave to them. Or if they're walking a dog, we'll say hello. But other than that, there's zero relationship. So it seems to go both ways.
And thanks everyone for sharing. I think this is such an important topic. Basically, unless you live on an island and you don't have any neighbors, except for maybe animals, then this is an issue that's probably important to your life and you probably have something to say about. So we're going to look at this golden rule from a Jewish perspective. Oh, thank you. So first of all, those of us joining online, I put this up on Sefaria. So this is Love Your Neighbors Yourself, a Jewish perspective. Just look under my name, and it should click in. And I wanted to start out with just a picture of the divide we have in this country. Bill and I were just talking about how our communities are starting to try to deal with this, and actually I'm realizing we don't really have an infrastructure. We have an infrastructure for religious engagement, but not for this divide that this ideological divide. And there's a picture of Uncle Sam, you know, caught in between the right and the left. Especially during the pandemic, I don't know about you, I felt that. I was at a number of events, especially kids' basketball games. That was the only time I ever thought there was going to be a civil war in this country, because the people that were wearing the masks and not wearing their masks were in outright battle with each other. So you really felt it. And one of the things that we noticed is that it's when you talk about purple areas, and we're somewhat of a purple area here in Western New York, it really doesn't mean that one neighbor is Republican, another is Democrat. It means you have one neighborhood that's Democrat and one neighborhood that's Republican. I just came back from Israel, and in Israel, everyone knows where the divide of the communities, whether it's ultra-Orthodox, modern Orthodox, Jewish, secular, Arab, Israeli, Palestinian, you know, the neighborhoods are defined and there's lines in the sand. And they know that everyone kind of lives in, but here, we didn't realize that. It wasn't like that not too long ago. I came, right before I came to Buffalo, we came from Mount Airy, Philadelphia, which, if you know, there was one Republican listed in all, the poor guy. I think it was a guy. But, that was exceptional. And now, 15 years later, that's actually the norm, that as you look around here, you could probably point out kind of, this is an area where it's going to be overwhelming Democrat, and this is an area overwhelming Republican. And it's a problem. That's what this article says, that there's a lot of evidence that any separation between groups has negative consequences. We see this in race and religion and in all kinds of change, and increasingly we see this in partisanship in the United States. People living, even more so than religious divide, which is a lot less than it was in the past, this ideological divide. So, the golden rule. This is the Jewish bumper sticker. It's 3 words, and you can see it on the next page. V'ahavta, which means, and you shall love. And I was realizing it's sort of an imperative for the future tense. You shall love l're'echa kamocha, to your neighbor as yourself. And each of these words, which it's a bumper sticker, it's easy to remember. It's unlike in English where it's love your neighbor as yourself, a number of different words. It's just 3 words. It's simple, it's easy, it's resonant, but each of the words is extremely complex. I had a teacher in high school. His name was Dr. Saul Wax. He had grown up in West Philadelphia with me and moved to the suburbs and was one of his Jewish historians at Gratz College in Philadelphia. And he took us through each of these. How do you love? What does it mean to love? What does it mean to be your neighbor? And what does it mean to love like yourself? He said loving you like yourself is actually the hardest thing. It's hard to love ourselves. So what does it mean that we have to love our neighbors like ourselves? The more I've thought about this, I think this is the really, as the article was suggesting, this is really the secret sauce for making democracy work. If you don't at least appreciate your neighbor, even if you disagree with them vehemently, if you can't at least see them as a human being, I think our democracy is kind of lost. You have to, once you start demonizing the other, there really can't be a sense. So when you go to the polls or whatever you're doing, we have to go away from this idea of, well, they're the worst people in the whole world. People have different ideas than you, but we have to be able to live and appreciate one another. If not, we'll have like the picture the political cartoon is suggesting. We're going to have 2 societies, a divided society. All right. So when we look at it in the Torah, first of all, you should see it in context. So we have 2 different readings from Leviticus 19. This is called the Holiness Code, and we read it in the portion Kedoshim. We also read it on Yom Kippur in the liberal Jewish world. Traditionally, they read not the Holiness Code, they read the Nakedness Code. So why are they reading the Nakedness Code? Those are the rules of sexual morality. Why? Because after Yom Kippur, everything's forgiven, that's when they cut loose. So that's what they used to do. That was, for all the teenagers, I guess. Yeah, rein in the energy. But as we look at the Holiness Code, these are sort of, before this in Leviticus, you have all the rules about sacrifice and sort of like a medical textbook. But it's not something the laity really needs to know. This is, it's one thing to have a medical textbook, but it doesn't teach you how to live your life. These are the morality of the priests. And here you have in Leviticus 19:16 through 18, Do not deal basely with members of your people. Do not profit by the blood of your fellow Israelite. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kin, but incur no guilt on their account. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against members of your people. Love your fellow, your neighbor, as yourself. I am Adonai. So you can see it fits within the context of many rules about how we need to treat one another. You have obligations. If you see someone doing something wrong, like Bill was saying about growing up, if you see those kids acting out, you need the neighbors to step in. But you also can't have that sense of hate. You have to see them as being connected to you and not bearing grudges. I love that, because grudges are the things, that they can go for decades and decades and decades, and they can be so corrosive. And then it ends. The love your neighbor as yourself is really the conclusion of this one set of principles. So as we see it, and do not profit by the blood of your fellow, we understand that in modern capitalism, right? That's, just because you can make a profit doesn't mean that you should. So there's another 2 verses a little bit later on in the same chapter that also talk about strangers. When strangers reside within your land, you shall not wrong them. The stranger who resides within you shall be to you as your citizens. You shall love each other as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I, Adonai, am your God. And throughout the text of the Holiness Code, it says, you are holy and I am God. So the central principle of the Levitical priests are that you should do these things to be holy, and that it's to be godly. It's connected to your central agreement with God, is to love your neighbor as yourself, and all of these principles. So as you're looking at this second part, 33 to 34, is really important, because this is the central thesis. Really, if you take out, forget the 10 Commandments, this is not in the 10 Commandments. I wrote recently, 51 verses after the 10 Commandments is when you get the central principle, which is you need to love and appreciate your neighbors, your strangers in your community. This is a community that was treated as a stranger for thousands of years in Egypt. They didn't want to replicate that situation. And I say it's the most important principle in Torah, one of the most important things, because that's not what was done in the ancient world. In the ancient world, it was kind of fend for yourself. That's what all of the monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam also picked up on this, is that we need to take care of one another, even if we're not kinsfolk. We need to have a direct, if you see someone on the street, you help them. You don't step over the homeless person or the unhomed person that you see there. And I say it's the most important principle because it's mentioned, they say, about 36 times in different variations. So it's over and over and over again, not just one time. You can say do not murder twice in the 2 sets of commandments, but be loving to the stranger. That has to be said over and over again, because it's the hardest thing that we can do. The stranger, it's easy to say they're out there. You have to see them as neighbors. So one of the questions that the rabbis are looking at is, what is the difference between re'echa, neighbor, direct kinsfolk maybe, and stranger, a ger? How are these 2 designations? How do you figure out what it is? I mean, for me, it's very confusing. What does it mean? Are you a neighbor if you're down the block, over there, around the corner? Is that still, Julia doesn't live too far from me either. So is it down the block, around the corner? It's a 5-minute drive in the same school district. We're neighbors, right? I mean, I would use that, and my wife would say, no, that's not neighbors. Neighbors are the people that live next to you. So we have that conflict too in our language. It's difficult to figure out where exactly neighbor is and the distance between stranger, because It could be you could really feel your neighbors were strangers to you. So as you look through the text, the rabbis start looking. I have a wonderful article that I can share afterwards. It's from Torah.com, which goes over the history of the Golden Rule. Here, as they start, you start looking, you have the commentary that's based on it. So this is from Sifra. This is, rabbinic commentary that comes afterwards. So what does it mean to not take revenge and not bear a grudge against the children of your people? Because we really have to define exactly, especially when we get to love, which we're going to see. What does it mean to love? I love my wife. I love my kids. I love Bill. I love, so many people in our community. But what exactly does that mean when we use that word? Okay, so this particular text says this is where it gets to be the golden rule. This is the all-embracing principle in the Torah, Rabbi Akiva says, to love your neighbor as yourself. But Ben Azai actually takes it one step further. This is not only the central principle in the Torah, it's for all of humanity. Because Ben Azai says, this is the numeration of the generations of Adam. In other words, before there were any Jews, this was the central rule. This is a human rule, not a Jewish rule. And that's what their distinction is. Okay, so loving your neighbor. They have a wonderful guide in Bava Metzia, which has to do with torts, with how we treat one another. It's a legal text from the Talmud. So the Gemara, that's the later rabbinic text, says, Rabbi Yochanan, what does he do with the verse, and your brother shall live with you? The Gemara answers, he requires the verse for that which is taught in a Braita. So, in other words, an earlier text. If two people were walking on a desolate path, and there was a jug of water in the possession of one of them, and the situation was such that if both drink from the jug, both will die, as there is not enough water. But if only one of them drinks, he will reach a settled area. There is a dispute. There's a dispute in the law. Ben Petora taught, it is preferable that both of them drink and die, and let neither one of them see the death of the other. This was the accepted opinion. And Rabbi Akiva came and taught, and your brother shall live with you, indicating your life shall take precedent over the life of the other. So the live there, live with you. So your life, you need to emphasize your life. So the question is, with neighbors, how far? What if it comes to this jug of water, two of you? Is your love of your neighbor more important than your love of yourself? He's saying that there's limits. There's a limit to your love here at the end, what Rabbi Akiva offers. It's an impossible situation. Sophie's choice. Here we are. Do we choose this or that? What does it mean? Okay, so they're getting really interesting. We're going to go now further, okay? All right, so here, this is Ramban, that's Nachmanides, not to be confused with Rambam. This is also from the Spanish period, and he's famous for taking on the Catholics in a disputation. There was a fierce battle, but he was a very well-respected rabbi around the time of Maimonides. And thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. This is the expression by way of overstatement, for a human heart is not able to accept a command to love one's neighbor as oneself. Moreover, Rabbi Akiva has already come and taught, your life shall take precedence over the life of your fellow being. Rather, the commandment of the Torah means that one is to love one's fellow human being in all matters as one loves all good for oneself. So what do you think it means? How far does that love extend? What does it mean to love? And what does it mean to put a rule in place? We don't have rules in our American Constitution that talk about love. When couples come together, as Tevye said, do I love you? You can't even say that in a relationship. It can mean many things. What do you think, how can we interpret this love? Here it's saying that you need to do good for the other person. If you have an opportunity to open the door for them, you need to take that opportunity. That is an obligation. If their animal runs away, your obligation is to bring it back as if it was your animal, right? What do you think when you think of love? What are they talking about? What do you think, Bill?
Well, I think that love is expressed, as you say, in a variety of ways, and it has to do with the regard that you have for the other, and you see them, you acknowledge them, and it's not I guess, we overuse that term love because we only have the one word it has such a broad meaning. In Greek, there are about 4 words that are translated love. There's philos, which is like friendship. And there's eros, which is more like romantic love. But the one that we find in the Greek New Testament is the word, and now it's escaped me, I apologize. Agape, thank you. Agape, which is selfless love, which is a sacrificial love, and it's how God's love is described. And so that's the kind of love in the Christian community that people are to have for one another, is this sense of being willing to sort of move aside so that another person can prosper, can be whole.
We actually, this word viahafta is an important word that's pretty familiar in our congregation, because we say the viahafta, which is the name of the prayer. It's the paragraph that is after the Shema. And when we sing the viahafta, you shall love your God with your whole heart and with your whole soul and with everything that you are. What does it describe about love? What does that mean to love God in that way? It means to do the commandments, to have, it's about duty. Love is about duty. Love in a relationship in that way, it would be, and that I love how Bill pointed that out, that we really are limited by our language. But love is taking out the trash, It's, doing the accounting. It's doing the details of our life. And in some sense, that is love. Love is vacuuming. But I think if we think about love as described in our literature or movies, we would not think about love as vacuuming at all. It feels it's more like eros. Love is a feeling that's communicated between one person and another of an appreciation. I think if I say, I love you, it means I feel connected to you. You matter to me. You're someone that's important to me. Any reflections on love here? I love you.
I think love, like you were saying, there's many different connotations of love. I think, to me, it's caring about somebody else. You're loving your neighbor, you're caring about your neighbor. That's the way I interpret it.
Anyone else want to go? Julia wants to. You want? Do you want to try? I know you're thinking.
Okay, well, I don't know if we'll get to this, but I'm struggling with something. So when all the talk about loving your neighbor, it's loving your neighbor, loving the stranger. But because of the governmental society that we also have enemies. And there's nothing here about loving your enemy. And the enemy is distinct from your neighbor, and it's also distinct from a stranger, because you know who your enemy is. But in the world today, I'm thinking of Ukraine and other places and all of the things that are happening when a government decides to wipe out a whole section of their population, or human rights are being violated in China, and all of these things are happening. So we have enemies, and how do we love our enemies? Yeah.
Well, that's what we have to think about next session when we do the Christianity thing. Did you want to talk?
You know, something that occurs to me is, you know, you remember when Yugoslavia was Balkanized after the fall of the Soviet Union. And suddenly Bosnians and Croatians and were at each other's throats where they had not been when it was Yugoslavia. All these ancient, you know, grievances just came up to the surface. You know, I remember reading about 500, 600-year-old, you know, grudges that people had were suddenly using as their excuse to, you know, attack their neighbors. So sometimes, you know, it was only the government that was keeping them contained, apparently. And you know, we found that in Iraq when Saddam Hussein fell. All of a sudden, you know, Christians who had lived in Iraq for a long time pretty freely suddenly were at risk, and some other populations that were marginal, and you know, those tendencies are always there, and you know, how we develop an ethic that helps us to regard even our enemies with respect and with compassion. I think that's why in Scripture it's repeated over and over and over, because we're constantly having to work at that. And you know, sometimes a government is able to contain that, but usually because it becomes the common enemy that everybody sort of identifies. So, you know, we're not great at it, and it's just something that we have to be, you know, working on all the time.
Well, I think, Julia, you're pointing out that we have the three, really, from early humans, right? There's three responses we could have to someone approaching us. We could see them as a friend or family and embrace them. You know, they could be a stranger or a guest. Either those ones are, they're not part of your group, but you're either a stranger danger, or you treated them as a guest and you're kind of welcoming them and bringing them inside even though they're not part of us, or an enemy. And an enemy was the one that's left off of there, where you push away or you actively attack. And I think today these things are very difficult. How do we you know, in the political divide, the left and the right see each other's enemies? What would it mean if you move that to strangers or neighbors? How does neighbor fit in there? Neighbor could be a stranger, a guest, or it could be family, or it could be an enemy. It could be any of those situations. We don't know. So it is really complex, because it's hard to figure out who our neighbor is, whether those neighbors fit into any of these other categories, and how we should treat each other. And I feel like, for the most part, when we're walking around the neighborhood or we have unknowns, to a certain extent, these question marks are coming up. You know, during the pandemic, right? Did you feel that? I mean, we have dogs, so walking the dogs, and you wonder when you're coming. I wrote a poem about this experience, because the person approaching you could be a threat to you because of the virus, right? This was early on in the pandemic. So here you're approaching and you're almost like militarily, even though you have nothing against the person. Now when I come to that same person, I'm relaxed next to them. But in that other world, we would cross the street. Not just because my dog was acting up, but because I'm legitimately nervous about that other person. Maybe part of what this golden rule is pushing us toward is to really think about it, because it's hard. This is not really a legal principle. It's not in the Ten Commandments. It would be hard to mediate that way. Which brings us to, sorry, Martin.
So you mentioned stranger danger, and that raises a question. How do we teach our children and our grandchildren to love people when you're always cautioning them about strangers? So that just opens up another conversation, and how do you tell the difference? And so anyway, it just sparked that in my mind when you said that.
Yeah, so a lot of times we have conflicting ideas. I'll just follow up for what Marta said for a second. In our community, we have security guards in front of every service, but we're welcoming. So how do you have both at the same time? And that's a debate. It's possible, but it's a, as my friend Wendy Smith said, it's a both and. Can you have both and?
I think this goes along with that. I've always said the simplest way to be a good person is to follow the golden rule. But it's almost become, that's an ideal. In practice, we're on guard all the time. If someone's ringing my doorbell, I look out the window and I don't know them, I'm not going to answer that door. Now I don't even answer the phone. You look, oh, I don't know that number. I don't answer the phone. So it has to be, you're not really being that welcoming to strangers because you're on guard. I mean, especially now with these Ring doorbells and so many cars being stolen and broken into, it's all over Facebook. So it has to be a situation where, say, a church event, we're having our big canine carnival again soon, and it's like all are welcomed. So then you're expecting, your guard is up a little, or down a little bit, because you said all are welcome. So your job is to be welcoming, but you expect it in that situation. A stranger at my door, especially in the summer, you know, I sit in the yard all the time. Everybody walks up and down my gate, and I'm always terrified that someone's gonna come in and I'm alone in the backyard. So to me, it's the ideal is to love everyone, but the practice is to be on guard now.
Yeah, that's a really, well, it's a really good point. So, yeah, Barry said it's a very sad state in our society, and I think that, you know, the picture that I used here is really a depiction of that. The shooter on May 14th, he came the day before or the week before to scope it out. Everyone thought it was a little unusual. What's this person doing? But you have two impulses. Is this person a danger, or are they just odd? How do you react to it? And it turns out he was a real danger. But in that moment when he's looking around, you couldn't tell. So the rabbis actually they actually didn't consider loving your neighbor as yourself as the golden rule. And I think that's a really important thing. We're going to go back to Hillel. Hillel and Shammai, these are two people. They are the epitome of goodly neighbors, that they disagree on everything, but they still find commonality. They're
Contemporaries with Jesus.
Yes, yep.
Same part of the first century.
Yeah, they're contemporaries with Jesus, exactly. And this is the most famous anecdote about Hillel and Shammai. Shammai was the strict teacher, and he took no nonsense. So someone came and wanted to convert to Judaism, and says to Shammai, "Convert me on the condition that you teach me the entire Torah standing on one foot." So it's ridiculous, preposterous. He chases him away with his cubit in hand. So he takes his cubit measuring stick. Get out of here. Hillel, on the other hand, the same Gentile comes before Hillel. He converted him and said to him, the principle. How did he teach him all the Torah on one foot? He said, that which is hateful to you, do not do to another. That is the entire Torah. The rest is interpretation. Go and study. So first of all, I love it. It's brilliant because what this person, this nudnik, we'd say, is coming in here is deliberately trying to provoke. And so he he gently tells him that that's not the way to do it. But he also takes the golden rule and makes it different. Instead of the positive, love your neighbor as yourself, it's the inverse of it, which is do not do what is hateful to you to another, right? So this is actually something that Hillel would say, that you can work with, that is actually something that you can do, and that you could have laws against. That it's much easier in a way than doing what's loving, because what's loving to you, the 5 languages of love. We all have different languages of love. What I might consider loving might not be loving, coming over, Julia described the neighbor, their idea of loving might be something very different than you're expressing. But we want to do it that way. But not doing something is easier than doing something, and not doing something that's going to hurt you.
That reminds me of the Hippocratic Oath, right? First, do no harm. And that's sort of where it all begins.
Yeah, the Hippocratic Oath. That's great. Yeah, so just do not harm. Keep it simple in a way, because it is so complex. We have all these kind of things. How can I love my neighbor as myself? I don't even love myself. How can I love my neighbor as myself? I don't even know who my neighbor is. How can I love my neighbor as myself? I have no idea how to love. How do we do all these things? Let's just keep it simple. I know, like in my household, because I have kids that like to annoy each other, I'm sure that none of you who have had siblings or raised kids understand about this, right? One of them will know, like my one son doesn't like it if you touch the back of his seat, and so my other son deliberately touches the back of his seat, or one of them gets annoyed with chewing, so the one will, but the essence of the role here is that is what you stay away from. If you know that it's going to bother you, don't do it to another person. It's just a basic kind of thing. Think of the things that will bother you. And it won't be 100%. Our kids react to different things. So one thing that bothers one won't bother another. But it's probably more likely, if you just abide by this rule, that you'll get it right. Right? Probably more likely that you can follow it and say, oh, that makes sense. That's going to bother me. So you're probably going to avoid more problems than it. So I love how they actually switch it around. So when they say, what's the Jewish golden rule? It's not, and you should love your neighbor as yourself. That is not the Jewish golden rule. The Jewish golden rule is do not do what is hateful. What is hateful for you to do not do to another. It's the inverse of it. So we'll conclude what I have here with Jonathan Sacks, who came to Western New York a few years before he died, and suggested that all of the world is moving towards a religious state, which is interesting. He made an argument at the end of his life, one of his last books. He said, you know what, secular people don't have enough kids, so it's only the religions that allow for the population to expand. That's an interesting article. Okay. What is so impressive about the Torah is that it both articulates the highest of high ideals, at the same time speaks to us as human beings. If we were angels, it would be easy to love one another. Human beings, it's hard. But we are not. An ethic that commands us to love our enemies without any hint as how we are to achieve this is simply unlivable. So if it didn't say re'echa, if it said enemies there, that would not work out. We would end up not being able to do that. It's an unrealistic goal. Instead, the Torah sets out a realistic program. By being honest with one another, talking things through, we may be able to achieve reconciliation, not always, to be sure, but often. How much distress and even bloodshed might be spared if humanity heeded this simple command? So I would say, just in reflecting, because Barry, you mentioned, it can, especially reading the news and seeing what's in there, it can be very discouraging today. I would say, in my experience, and maybe because of my role, I think the majority of people do want to help one another. The majority of people that I encounter want to be good neighbors. And a lot of it is approach. Working in my workings with the Jewish Community Relations Council, when someone does something that bothers us, we tend not to take an aggressive approach to condemn what happened, but try to approach it as an educational opportunity. Because most grievances that come between human beings are just mistakes, not understanding the language that the other person is speaking, not understanding the customs and culture, and those are correctable just with education. So that is actually one of the ways that we love our neighbor, is to see the best, see the. Bill introduced the way that interreligious. What was the speaker? What's her name from Atlanta? There's 3 principles that do not take the best of what you have and compare it to the worst of another. Do not take an expert and compete it. Barbara Brown Taylor, yeah. And then what was the last? Oh, and see a little bit holy envy.
Yeah, make room for holy envy.
Yeah. So I think that those are good neighborly advice. Any other thoughts before we conclude this session? And we'll be back in 2 weeks in North Presbyterian.
I have a little story. So I have a story that happened that what you were just talking about educating and not being aggressive about something. I had a group of women that I was at dinner with, and I didn't know them really well, but I knew them a little bit. And one was telling a story about something she purchased. This is difficult for me to say. So she purchased this something, and the guy quoted her, I guess it was a service. It was like someone to plow her driveway, for example. And she used the expression, which I had never heard and which upset me, that she Jewed him down to, like, she negotiated the price. So I, as the only Jew in this group of 5 women, I just kind of, it's like I got hit in the face or something. And she saw my expression, and she apologized. And I said, I've never heard that. And she said, oh, people use it all the time. And so we just had our meal. Well, then I called her the next day because it really bothered me. And I told her, I said, I would really appreciate it if you just stop using that. It's just a stereotype, and it just keeps contributing to a negative feeling towards Jews. And just for me, could you please not use that? And so I think she's making an effort not to do that. But that was the way I handled it, to try not to get really angry and not storm out of there, but to educate her and how hurtful that expression was, and others like it. Oh, yeah.
I have a similar story. It was in my favorite store, Dollar Tree, and you're separated by aisles, and this woman just let her kids run wild. They were all over the store, and they'd say, "Can I buy this? Can we take this? Can I have this?" And she kept saying to them, "Is it from China? Because we don't do anything from China. China's bad. Don't put that down. If it's from China, nothing from China." And they kept raising something, "No, that's made in China. That's no good. You cannot do that." And I was getting angrier and angrier. Julie knows why. And I finally, this went on for a while. I heard China maybe 100 times in a negative way. So I went around the aisle and I looked her right in the face, because you have to do that sometimes with people. You have to look them right in the eye. And I said, my granddaughters are from China. Are they bad? Are they evil? And she said, well, I don't mean that. And I said, but that's what you're telling your kids. You're saying everybody from China is bad. I said, you have to change the way you're saying that. You can say, we don't know where that candy's from, so we'll buy this candy. You can say it a million different ways, but you don't keep maligning one country or something. And I'm not sure I got the message across, but I sure tried my darndest, 'cause
Well, I think these are wonderful examples of reproving your neighbor. And that's one of the things, that's actually a way of loving. And it's probably, but love is not in that sense of eros, not in that sense of caring even, just it's our obligation to have those hard conversations. And that's part, because that could lead to other things. It's both of you, I'm sure, are very good at having those conversations, but it's extremely difficult to have, and hopefully it makes a difference, but it's necessary. And that is part of loving your neighbor as yourself. That is part of the Leviticus ideal, at least. It's baked into there. All right, so we'll continue the conversation. I'm really looking forward. And maybe you'll say, oh, you love this class so much, you'll come in person in 2 weeks to North.
Next Friday.
Oh yeah, next Friday we're going to be in person. We're going to.
Here, and then on the 26th at North.
Yeah, so next Friday, the 24th, we'll be here at Shir Shalom North. Bill will be here, and then I'll be visiting North Presbyterian at 10:15, right? 10:15 on Sunday, the 26th. All right. Yeah.
Class again on the 29th.
Yeah. We could keep going about this. It's such an interesting topic. So, all right. Thank you for joining us. And I do have these other sheets here.
Yeah.
We can bring them next time too. If anyone wants, yeah, just put it back. If anyone wants like a more, this is a really interesting article. If you're
Oh, it's another article?
This is a more comprehensive of the evolution of the golden rules.
Oh, thank you, yeah.
Well, we got the next meeting.
Oh, Nancy.
Next meeting, Democrats.
We're pretty much all set, Mr.
Okay.
Party.
Citrus party, you said?
Everybody says, "Oh, third party's no good." Well, what we are right now is no good. And by the way, Abraham Lincoln was the third party.
I thought you said citrus, like an orange party?
I don't care what you call it.
Because in Israel, they have the cab drivers party and the marijuana party. All right, let's see if I can.